I don't know about you, but I'm really excited to have Dr. Lynn Gibson here today to speak to us on her research from 1 Timothy. I think for many of us, 1 Timothy presents challenges and discomfort because there are passages of this piece of scripture that are so often used to limit the opportunities and the ministry of women. And so it can be a hard area of scripture for us to contemplate, reflect on, and hear what God has to say. Now, Lynn decided to do a whole PhD on 1 Timothy and to bring, I think, a better contextual understanding to what the issues are and what is going on. So that's what we're looking forward to hearing from her about today. Lynn is a New Testament scholar specialising in the pastoral epistles, and her PhD dissertation, published in 2020, has the title Persuading Shipwrecked Men, Rhetorical Strategies in 1 Timothy. Sounds very interesting. So Lynn is going to be sharing both that today, something from her research, but also a little bit of her own personal story as she has come to terms with this aspect of scripture and what her own journey has been in terms of her understanding of the position of women and men together in the church. Lynn is becoming a very established scholar. She has published numerous books, book chapters and articles, and I think it's not uncommon for me to see a new hooray on Facebook that there's something new coming out that Lynn's been published or involved with. And she serves on a number of scholarly committees, including the Disputed Paulines Seminar at the Society of Biblical Literature annual conference. Lynn also has extensive ministry experience, serving as a university Christian worker, a pastor assistant and associate Baptist minister. And in 2022, Lynn was a Macquarie University Gale Fellow, spending about 6 months, was it, based in Rome, in researching numismatics and the New Testament. And she has a new book probably coming out, hopefully start heading in that direction before too long. So 2022 was pretty fun to watch Lynn's adventures on Facebook and just the amazing discoveries that she was making in her research at her time there in Rome. So Lynn, I really want to welcome you today, and we're just really pleased that you are here to share with us.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm going to tell you a bit about my story and how it's intertwined with my research into 1 Timothy. But the other weekend, Andrew's here with me. Andrew is my husband. We went to see Ross Noel at the Wagga Wagga Civic Theatre. Now, you know who I mean? He's a comedian. He was living here for a while in Australia, and he comes and does like tours every now and again. So if you know Ross, he is able to take a comment from the audience and then kind of run with it, which is pretty incredible to watch him do that. And a comedian makes you laugh at stuff that's taboo or awkward to talk about. So, you know, he has this funny story about how he actually had the ashes of a lady up on stage. And, you know, for us, talking about death is really hard, but he was making the whole audience, like the Wagga Civic Theatre was packed, was all laughing about this lady's ashes in this urn. And we can laugh at other funny stuff. The thing with humour is that it can be used for different things. So, you know, it can be used as a survival tactic for when people find themselves in oppressed circumstances. And I know this because I sat next to a girl, a young lady who was doing her PhD, but she was doing on how people from former African colony in Africa, whose name escapes me at the moment, that's terrible, how they coped with being a colonised people with humour. And I was really interested in that topic. So I've got a cartoon sort of illustrates my point. So sorry about the depression and the despotism, folks, but it's all part of my plan to return the government to the people. Okay, so while I was doing some reading on this topic, I came across this article, Humour as a serious strategy of non-violent resistance to oppression. And it's written by, excuse my pronunciation, Marge Ken Jule Sorensen. She might be like Norwegian or something, or Swedish. And in it, she identifies 3 different ways that humour theoretically acts as non-violent resistance. And one of those ways is by turning oppression upside down. This functions, she says, as the most powerful potential because it changes the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. So, what about we give it a go? So the theme for 2023 for CBE is 1,000 tears, tears of joy and tears of sorrow. Let's do a bit of laughing before we get stuck in the hard stuff and shed some tears. So I know that you've all probably watched more than enough videos, interviews of complementarians talking about how women need to be restricted in ministry roles because that's what the Bible says. And I wonder if you've noticed a pattern. I've noticed a pattern about how complementarians talk. So you've got to help me out here because, I'm not really a comedian. But anyway, what we're talking about, to be absolutely clear, is that we're talking about, the general essence of them all. Think of all of them that you've ever seen, all kind of rolled up together. So let's pretend I'm a complementarian scholar. Let's show the slide. I'm a TV set. It's all going to go onto YouTube. And I'm here, I'm being interviewed about complementarian stance on 1 Timothy. And first of all, I kind of sit back and I'm relaxed, I have an open posture, I want to make sure I look reasonable, and the tone, I think, is normally light and kind of a bit breezy, and I want to tell you how egalitarians just have it wrong. They have the Bible wrong. And then you say something sympathetic about women, about women's desire to serve in the church. And you've got to, things slow down a little and you've got to look a little sympathetic. I don't know. Poor women. And then this is where I really notice the pattern to the change in body language. You kind of sit forward. And this is where it cuts to the Bible says bit. And its tone changes and dialogue slows and you've got to look very sage-like. So how can I do it without, can't smile. Yes, Bible says. So what do you reckon? Have I got it right? Have you noticed this kind of pattern? It's whether it doesn't matter if they're standing up speaking, or they're sitting down and being interviewed. It's sort of like has this kind of flow where you go from saying that egalitarians have it wrong to being sympathetic about women to being, oh no, but the Bible says. And there's kind of like a physical presence to it. This is the thing I want to stress. Okay, so it's the next slide now. So this is a bit I want to need to read out. So although we've had a bit of fun, it's important to notice these kinds of persuasive patterns. In Greco-Roman rhetoric, they are called topoi. It's where we get our word topic from, and the Greek word can be used in this general sense. But I want to draw your attention more to the formal use of the word when discussing Greek rhetoric. Historian John Hesk says that an Aristotelian topos can be a pattern of argument, which one would expect to be able to deploy again and again in different contexts and in relation to different political, forensic and epidemic content. A topos is a pattern of argument. which ancient orators used to persuade the audience to their point of view. That's the whole point of rhetoric, right? Just think of a lawyer in a courtroom, you're trying to persuade a judge or a jury over to your point of view. These patterns of argument were taught to schoolboys from the time they went to the grammarian at around about 9 or 10 until they finished their education, which was with the rhetor from about the age of 17 to 19. That's if they had a complete formal education to be a gentleman. But if a person didn't have a complete education, they could still be aware of these patterns if they had heard enough sophists giving speeches. Now, it was a favourite pastime in the ancient world to go and hear a sophist. Just thank goodness for TV, really. Once you were aware of such persuasive patterns, you can start to see them even in our modern world. So Donald Trump's rhetorical style is classic sophism. And he's used rhetorical devices to a rather alarming effect. Anyway. And there's a pattern to complementarian arguments to interpret 1 Timothy chapter 2. And we're not just talking about the intellectual arguments here, but we're talking about oratory. And as we explored in the skit, there is a persuasive use of body language. This is what rhetorical training in the ancient world was about. Not only was the rhetorical, the argumentative flow, to be persuasive, but it was also your voice, your gesture, your stance. You'll see this in, like, if you've been to like Rome or Greece or anything like that, you'll see these statues, you know, the man might have the hand in the toga and he's got his hand up. Or holding a scroll, and he's got foot forward. You know, there's a certain posture to speaking, persuasive speech. So it's the overall deportment that was to be persuasive. So that's if you were a man, okay, of a certain social economic class. Women were never trained in oratory, and we need to remember this when we talk about 1 Timothy chapter 2. But we also need to be clear that it's something of a misconception. It's not as if women never spoke in public. They could speak in public, but usually under extreme circumstances. Women of a certain socioeconomic class could band together and make a case for change. Men didn't particularly like it, but they recognised that their women had the power to do so. And it's not as if men always thought that women should always be closeted away and never played an active role in civil society. As far back as the 4th century BCE, Plato argued that aristocratic women needed to be educated and ready to lead in times of war. You see, it's about circumstances. Greco-Roman men realised the necessity for female education and preparedness for leadership. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Jewish men thought the same, which is why the novel Judith should be included in our Bibles. And we all should know Judith. It's a cracker of a tale. So I think I've laid out the background enough. And I probably should get on and tell you about my story. And I just want to note that this is my perspective, right? Others might have a different perspective who are there. But this is just how I felt and experienced it. So, yeah, my story. So I first heard about complementarian when I was working with student life at Macquarie University. And I heard from the AFES workers. And at the time, I was the coordinator for the student life group at Macquarie Uni. So we couldn't be campus directors because that was sounding too much like we had authority. So we called coordinators because men and women coordinators. So it's a bit funny, really, but anyway. So I first heard about this complementarian. I didn't know it was called complementarian. I just heard that what they were saying was that women couldn't teach Bible and they couldn't lead men in church because it was unbiblical. That was the language that was being used quite a bit. It was all unbiblical. And it was all about 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 to 15. Said that women couldn't have authority over men. And I had a good look for myself. And, I thought, I'm not convinced, because I didn't think the argument that I heard actually addressed verse 15 about women being saved at childbirth. Anyway, in the end, I got to CHOP as campus coordinator. Because remember, this is my view, in order to make way for a man to have that position. And although I was leading the most successful campus ministry that we had in Australia, I really wasn't given, I didn't feel like I was given credit as a good leader. Rather, I was kind of in the way because we needed to have a man at the helm. And I kind of had a bit of a nervous breakdown there because my success in leadership wasn't being recognised. And at the end of the day, I was only ever a woman in the wrong position. So although I was making good progress in learning how to be a leader, so I was still learning, still making mistakes. But, I noticed the men made mistakes, but it was all okay for them to make mistakes. Anyway, I could never really get back to that place because I didn't have enough experience. I'm always being told I don't have enough experience, I'll tell you that. And that my gender made me unqualified for nearly every leadership position I went for. Anyway, as well as in student life, I studied BTH at Sydney Missionary Bible College, SMBC, and then that kind of morphed into a Master of Divinity. And it took me about 8 years. It took me 8 years to finish that off. I just had a baby in the middle of it. Anyway, so it was while I was doing a theology class on ecclesiology that I decided to tackle an essay question on women in ministry. And I thought I'd better have a close look at why I wasn't able to teach or lead men. And I need to convince myself, because I wasn't convinced when I just read my Bible. And I thought I would know this, I would be convinced by the end of the essay. And what happened was I just wasn't convinced at all. So by that stage, because I was doing part-time, rather than doing all these sort of subjects at the same time, I was doing them kind of consecutive. So I'd done all my Bible study subjects, so I'd done New Testament and Old Testament. So I had a reasonably good grasp of exegesis. And when I read through the egalitarian and complementarian literature, just wasn't convinced by either view. And by far the most shocking, thing was that the exegesis 1 Timothy chapter 2 by complementarians, in my view, was extremely poor. And I couldn't work out why people who claimed to know the Bible said that they thought the exegesis of Thomas Schreiner and Wayne Grudem explained the text. I thought you could drive a truck through the explanation and miss. Their arguments, ignored crucial exegetical points, and the explanation of verse 15 was very weak, I thought. In fact, in that first essay, I think I counted about 9 different suggestions as to what's meant by a woman is, or it's actually, it says women in translation, is saved through, or even when we say through childbirth. What was even more shocking was that Thomas Schreiner, in his 1995 essay, had claimed that women through Eve were more inclined to be deceived, and a view he later peddled on in the later essay in 2005. Now, I knew from my study of Genesis and 1 and 2, and what we were taught in Old Testament class at SMBC, was this couldn't possibly be the case, right? When women aren't sort of like made to be more prone to being deceived. It's just not right. Anyway, I couldn't understand how anybody couldn't see the glaring problems in the exegesis went towards a better explanation. And I just still can't. So coming to this conclusion, it just took an emotional toll on me because I just remember writing this essay, lying in bed thinking, oh, maybe I'm not, maybe no, I'm not an evangelical anymore. That would be the end of the world. Pretty funny now, but anyway, maybe I didn't have a identity. I felt like I was giving up my identity. But I decided to be an evangelical, someone that actually did take scriptures seriously and work hard at understanding scriptures. Then I was still an evangelical. Anyway, so I was so that's where I was left at the end of the night. The thing is, I was kind of in no man's land because I wasn't convinced by the egalitarian exegesis of these verses either. They relied on historical context of construction of the background that didn't seem to have anything to do with the rest of the letter. Kruger and Kruger relied on a wild confrontation of stories related to the myths about Artemis, which really didn't seem to have anything to do with the some who wanted to be teachers of law in chapter 1, verses 6 to 7. In fact, no one, as far as I could see, was discussing chapter 2 in the context of the letter. Because I couldn't find anybody actually dealing with the historical context of the background of the church in Ephesus, I decided to look at the verse 15 in the context of motherhood in the Bible for my MTH project, my MD project, sorry. And when I look back at this essay, I actually don't agree with myself altogether, but it certainly clarified my thinking. And I wasn't happy about the background dispute that the men were having in Ephesus. That just kept gnawing at me. What was really needed was a historical approach. So by this time, I'd been working for Anglican Church as their family and children's worker. But as I finished my MDiv, I lost my job because they couldn't keep to afford to pay me. And so, you know, quick with that Master Divinity and 12 years of ministry experience, I swiftly found another job. No, not really, I'm just joking there. I was unemployed for 4 years. So I was a stay-at-home mum that read hermeneutics and philosophy at the fill in the time. After 4 years, I got a job at a Baptist church as their family and children's pastor. And I thought, at long last, I finally made it. I'm pastor. Because it was my dream job. I was going to be an associate pastor. I didn't even make it to the accreditation training because just the whole church just imploded because of all these kind of simmering underlying issues that they hadn't dealt with. And I just kind of inadvertently turning up trying to do ministry and outreach stuff, just kind of the wick to the whole thing. So after 18 months, I'd resigned, senior pastor resigned, and so I was left in a church. I wasn't too sure if it really needed an outreach worker to work with families. And I've met other women who've been in this sort of position too, get left on the rock. So it's just, this is all supposed to be, right? Again. Anyway, by this stage, I was enrolled at Macquarie Uni as in a Master of Arts in Early Christian and Jewish Studies. And so I stepped up my study and I completed my Master of Arts in 3.5 years. And I got a high distinction for my MA thesis on 1 Timothy chapter 2, and much of that is I'm going to share with you today. My PhD isn't really about chapter 2 because, as I said, the big problem is interpreting chapter 2 in the context of the whole letter. So if you want to go to the next slide. It's my published thesis. It's so exciting when it came in the box. So my thesis is on how chapter 1 sets up like the thesis of the letter. And my starting point was actually German scholar Debilius, who argued that 1 Timothy was a patchwork of traditions and ideas without any overall coherence. And he said that the interest of the letter is directed in 2 points, one to church order and the other to refutation of heretics. And you know what? That's exactly how complementarian scholars read the letter. with the whole of chapter 2 out, and it could stand on its own with universal instructions, right, about church order. So I want to interact a little bit with a recent interview that some of you sent me the video for, which was Lionel Windsor talking with Dominic Steele on Pastor's Heart about the context of the 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 11 to 15, and he said that verse 1 of chapter 2 was context of those instructions. He said it was a formal gathered worship of church, which involved a sermon. And this, folks, is incredibly anachronistic, and let alone make any sense of how it fits into the whole letter. So I think we're up to the bit that you want to know about. So what is a better interpretation of 1 Timothy chapter 2? So in the time I have, I want us to have a crack at it. I can't cover everything, but most of what I'm saying is out there published. I've got it published, and it's all kind of collected on my ResearchGate page. So if you Google Lynn Kitson ResearchGate, which is all one word, it will pop up. And my thesis, you can actually download from the Macquarie Uni website, and you don't have to pay the $130 Australian for it. That's just a tip there. So my big question for my PhD was, what is the particular historical context behind the letter? Well, we don't have to guess because the writer tells us. He urges Timothy right at the beginning of the letter to command certain people not to teach the other instruction nor pay attention to myths and endless genealogies, because spending time on this results in intense investigations rather than producing the attention that is to be given to God's administration, which is accompanied by appropriate faithfulness. Most translators want to translate the what not to teach as to teach false doctrines, like NIV, something similar like that. Now, I think this is confusing because it focuses our attention on the idea that it's a doctrinal problem, and it misses the fact that the false teachers are promoting not just problematic doctrines, but the whole way of life, right? They've got a whole program about how you're meant to live your Christian life. So it's a problem with ethics, and it's leading to a whole lot of serious problems in the church. And we should have another slide. And these are problems. You find it in chapter 6. If anyone teaches the other instruction and does not agree to the sound instruction of our Lord Jesus Christ and to godly teaching, they are conceited and understand nothing. They have an unhealthy interest in controversies and quarrels about words that result in envy, strife, malicious talk, and evil suspicions and constant friction between people of corrupt mind who have been robbed of the truth and who think godliness is a means to financial gain. He repeats what he says at the beginning of the letter, but gives some additional information. This is a church in serious trouble because of the activity of certain people. If we go back to chapter 1 and we go to the end of the chapter, we'll see that 2 of those certain people, Hymenaeus and Alexander, have been kicked out of the congregation. So let's guess here and say that they're the ringleaders. It's their instructional education program that's causing the problem. Now, Adam White, get to the next slide, please, in this book, has done a lot of work on process of excommunication in cities, associations, and early Christ groups. And overall, in the Greco-Roman world, people were excommunicated from their social groups for causing serious harm or potentially causing serious harm to the group. So putting it together, Hymenaeus and Alexander have been excommunicated for causing serious harm to the group because they've been promoting an unhealthy interest in controversies, quarrels about words. And this has resulted in envy, strife, malicious talk, evil suspicions, and constant friction between people of corrupt mind. And now there is potential for this kind of behaviour to continue because certain people still remain in the church. In other words, those who have been influenced by Jimenez and Alexander are still there, and that's the context of chapter 2. Now, Dr. Windsor in his talk said that the instructions were not teaching the other instructions at chapter 1, verse 3. They didn't apply to the women because of the masculine plural pronoun tisin and other masculine nouns in chapter 1. Thing is, though, if you're an ancient Greek speaker and you wanted to talk about a mixed group of people, men and women, boys and girls, then you would use the masculine plural to say that. You'd say men, but this would be referring to everyone. So the tisin could be referring to certain people, not just certain men. Now, I argued my thesis, that's why I'm taking time to say this, because you'll go, oh, but you've said in your thesis. I argued my thesis that we could translate the word as certain men, not because I think these instructions don't apply to women, but because it reflects the rhetorical strategy of the writer. Remember I said that rhetorical devices and the power to persuade. His purpose is to try and persuade these people to stop following the instruction of Jimenez and Alexander and turn their attention to actually doing stuff for God. From the reader's point of view, the people looming large in their minds is Jimenez and Alexander because they have been through a whole big process of kicking them out. The men that followed them are in danger of the same fate. Some have rejected being faithful and having conscience, and so have shipwrecked suffered shipwreck and with regard to their faith. This is why isn't the writer naming these certain people? Well, it's because it's a rhetorical strategy not to name one's opponents if one is seeking to win them over. And also, it's just impolite. So it's a big deal when he names Jimenez and Alexander because it shows that they are on the outer and they're not part of the church anymore. So next slide. So what does this tell us about chapter 2? I can't go into too much detail. You probably think I'm doing a lot of detail now, but there's more detail. I could do more, but can't do much. But it's an important thing that there's no hard break between the discourse at chapter 2, verse 1. He isn't moving to a whole new topic like universal instructions on church order. Verse 1 has therefore, and which usually translated then, because interpreters don't know how to connect the idea of prayer to blasphemy of Jimenez and Alexander. At the end of the chapter, or the digression, he finishes with the writer finishes by saying Jimenez and Alexander have been excommunicated, so they've been taught not to blaspheme. Perhaps we go back to the previous slide. The Alexander Jimenez, who have been handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. So we go back to chapter 2. Thank you. And then he argues that urges that all kinds of prayers are to be made. This may well be in the corporate meeting time, but it's not the salient thing here, right? The salient thing is that prayer is the opposite of blasphemy. The basic rhetorical strategy right throughout the letter is contrast. Don't do X, do Y instead. Don't be like an A, be like a B instead. Okay, so he's warning them not to be like Jimenez and Alexander, who are blasphemous. The writer urges, therefore, be pious. The whole chapter is about being pious. Okay? And piety is virtue dominates the rest of the passage. Notice that the women are to be doubly pious. They are to have a godly piety in verse 10. So what are we doing here is that we're undoing the usual complementary pattern of interpretation, which ignores the context of the letter. We're breaking down the barriers to seeing how verses 1 to 15 function of persuasive discourse to turn certain people away from the other instructional educational program. So let's jump to verse 8. Therefore, I want men everywhere to pray and lift up holy hands without anger or disputing. Here he's just repeating verse 1 because in verses 3 to 7 he got a bit sidetracked. Without anger and dispute, reminds the listener that he is talking about the problems caused by Hymenaeus and Alexander. That's a context here for the next 7 verses. Verse 9 has likewise, which is quite a powerful conjunction in this context. It's often not translated because, once again, interpreters struggle to see the connection between the instructions to the men and instructions to the women. The likewise is saying, as for it is for the men, so it is for the women. The women aren't dressing to pray, but in their deportment, like the men raising holy hands, they are to demonstrate piety. They are to do good works appropriate for women who profess, what is it? Godly piety. They have argued elsewhere that verse 11 rounds off the positive instructions of verses 9 to 10. Quietness, it's not silence, is an expression of good deportment and stands in contrast to the anger and disputing in verse 8. So it is also a powerful persuasive tool for the speaker. So when the writer says that the women are to be quiet, he means they are to speak in a fitting manner with godly piety. Next slide. Yep, verse 12 is where we're up to. So now verse 12. I know that you're all making. So to teach begins this verse. It's in the emphatic position in the Greek. Not there in the English because it would make sense. Now, complementarians take this to mean that Paul does not want women to teach men in the church. But given that the whole purpose of the letter is to dissuade certain people not to teach the other instruction, then it stands to reason that he's talking about women not teaching the other instruction. So while you might think at the beginning of the letter that the command not to teach the other instruction is directed at men, here in verse 12, it becomes apparent that he's directing his command to the women as well. He doesn't mention their names because he wants to persuade them to do as he demands, and it would be impolite for him to name another man's wife as an opponent. That the women are engaged in teaching is confirmed in chapter 5 because some young widows are saying things that they should not say, and some of them are following the instructions of Hymenaeus and Alexander. So what is the all have authority over men about? Well, Cynthia Westfall has done extensive discussion on this phrase, and she argues for the word abuse instead of authority. And I think this is like really close. She's saying not to abuse. But I think it would be better if you say to lord it over, to retain the sense of arrogance that the men possess in chapter 1. Because remember, likewise, verse 9, likewise, the women are not to be like the men. So he commands, I do not want a wife to teach the other instruction, nor to lord it over her husband. That he's referring to a wife and husband is implied by the use of Adam and Eve as countermodels, because Adam and Eve are husband and wife in Jewish thinking. But because we're located in the context of false teaching, we can go to chapter 4, where the other instruction is described. Which you could go, yep, thank you. In verse 3, we're told that the false teachers forbid people to marry, and they are to have special diet. In other words, they are ascetics who are practicing sexual renunciation, which is much like the problem in Corinth Paul is describing in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. So read against this context, the command is for the women not to bully her husband into renouncing sexual relations. The renunciation of sexual relations in marriage was a thing in early Christianity. It was called spiritual marriage. We might notice that the writer uses the creation account to oppose the prohibition of marriage in chapter 4, as he uses in chapter 2 in verses 13 and 14. And since the certain people of chapter 1 think they're red hot teachers of the law, it seems to me that the problem he is addressing is a misuse of the Genesis account of creation. Asceticism was a thing in Jewish circles, so perhaps the actual teaching related to some kind of teaching about the flesh. Doesn't much matter that we don't know all the details, because there's enough at least to reconstruct the scenario that from the letter itself, with the aid of the broad historical trajectory of asceticism in the early church. And this brings me to this next slide. What's the next slide?
That's the next slide.
Oh, that's the conclusion. Okay, go back to where we were. This brings me to verse 15. The verse that plagued me all this time. Here it is. Well, it's easy to see if we see it as a positive response against prohibition against sexual relations. Now, a lot of translations say something like the NIV, but women. But this is incorrect because the Greek word is still singular. It's she will be saved. Translators translate it as a plural because they're thinking that still applies to women in the congregation. But he's talking about the wife of verse 12. She will be saved through childbirth. This word in this context refers to the whole process. I mean, that's what I can say. This word coitus, pregnancy, and the act of giving birth. It saves her from the ill effects of the other instruction, which would cause her to persuade, which is a nuance of the word teach, and bully her husband into renouncing sex. I think he's using childbearing as a euphemism because he's talking to a whole bunch of married ladies. He then switches back to the plural if they continue, which now makes sense if we're talking about the husband and wife. The wife will be saved from the ill effects of the other instruction if they, the husband and wife, continue in love, in faith, love, and holiness with appropriate self-restraint fitting for the bedroom. And Roman philosophers would be clapping at that point. Very good. Next slide, which is my conclusion. So in conclusion, folks, the certain people in 1 Timothy, the men and women, the husbands and wives, are to refrain from teaching the other instruction and devote themselves to God's work. The goal of this instruction is love. It's not just about enough to be obedient. A believer must love, and this love must arise out of one's good character. It's not about believers fulfilling roles or being blindly obedient without any purpose. In the big scheme of things, the object of all this instruction is for believers to love one another by conducting themselves appropriately in God's household, which is the church. It's in chapter 3, verse 15. Given this is the big principle, perhaps in the modern church, we don't have to lock everyone into restrictive gender roles, and we can allow everyone to pursue their God-given gifts as long as we, together, conform to the gospel, which is what he says he wants in chapter 1, verse 10. Okay. I've got to the cartoon. Yeah. Anyway, I said we'd have fun. So perhaps we could go to Skype. We won't leave that up. That's good. So I love what Beth Barr says. It's like, just go, be free. So while we've got that up, who has a question for me? Tom.
I think it was Paul Barker that insisted in the translation